Hello and welcome to another podcast of Father and Joe. I'm Joe Rocky here with Father Boniface Hicks. And Father, our last episode was about the second coming and about turning the page. Part of it, the discussion being that we live lives in routines. Most of us strive to get in routines, whether the routine is good, bad, or indifferent. Part of human nature is to get into a routine. And there's certain cycles within the years we mentioned a couple episodes ago that intentionally the church breaks up the seasons to make us focus. Just as nature goes from super hot in the summer to super cold in the winter, there's there's an interrupt where we have to have an opportunity to sit back and look at our routines and evaluate them. And many people do that at New Year's, as you were concluding our last episode about, if there's a year that you had pain or a hard spot that you're getting over, it doesn't need to be an entire year of problems. But one of the things that we had been discussing a lot here is salvation and being open to it. And the thought had been coming to me that so many of our own problems, we're probably a cause of it. Maybe not 100% of the cause, but certainly a contributing factor at least. And it seems to be an unwillingness to accept salvation in the very broadest sense, to give us happiness and forgiveness to move on. And I wanted to talk today kind of specifically about the church's teachings, because as we're looking forward to truly get a change in life, maybe we're at a spot where listening to the last episode about the second coming was a very fearful side because we think that we're on the bad side of the fence or we just don't know. And unknown is scary. So, with this being a chance of where we're kind of already reevaluating our routines and at a spot for a pattern interrupt, why don't we take a look at what the church teaches as far as moving forward from incorrect situations, bad spots, painful spots, and moving into a place of peace and love.
Yeah, fortunately, it's always possible to do that. I mean, it's kind of the amazing thing about our faith. I remember it hit home to me in a particular way when I had a chance to um, go and do some ministry in prison, and I just was thinking as I met these prisoners, who I found out later a number of them were murderers, some of them child molesters. I mean, some pretty bad stuff. Most of them in for a long time or for life, that even in those terrible circumstances, I just thought, because we have this attitude, like, I know when I was growing up, certainly my parents, the last thing they wanted me to do was to end up in prison, So that's kind of the ultimate bad example. If you do that, you get arrested or whatever, kind of threatened with the law, the consequences of the law. And then to meet people to whom that happened, that they did eventually push the limit so far that they got arrested, that they were convicted, that they ended up in prison. And it's very easy to think like, well, their life is over, you know. But meeting these prisoners, now I got to meet them in part because they listened to WAOB radio, on which I also, do a lot of audio teaching like we're doing here on our podcast. But they were interested in meeting me, and a priest friend of mine was the prison chaplain, and in another case, a deacon friend of mine is a prison chaplain, and so they brought me in to do some ministry in the prison. And these guys had found a new beginning. They weren't saints. It's not like they didn't have any problems anymore. It's not like they started glowing with halos or something like that after they had a conversion in prison. They still had their own struggles, a certain gruffness, an ease of being drawn into bad things by bad influences, and but also something beautiful was at work in their souls, and I could really see in the way that they listened. In the one case, I was teaching on the rule of Saint Benedict and how that would apply to prisoners. And the way that they were listening, the questions that they were asking, how they could really apply the teaching of Saint Benedict to their lives, really taking it in, how they could pray more, how they could use their solitude to good advantage. Something I learned, which I was surprised by, I said, probably you have a lot of silence. And they go, no, we never get silence. In prison, sometimes we think of that as being this kind of really desolate, quiet place because everything's sectioned out. Oh, they said, we long for periods of silence. It's so nice at the Mass when the priest is, just after the Eucharist or whatever, leaves some period of silence. So we just don't get that. But anyway, how they could use their circumstances to grow in holiness. And they were really interested in that. And I had this realization, which I would have known kind of abstractly, theologically, but it just became very concrete to me in that moment. The truth that we believe, if there were a better way for God to save and sanctify, in other words, to make these men saints, then he wouldn't have included prison. But in fact, in the mystery of God's providence, prison was part of the best path for them to become saints. Now, that's given the bad decisions that they made, in some cases, the bad circumstances they grew up in. Not saying that from their birth they were destined to go to prison. I'm not saying that. But as things progressed based on their decisions, the best path for them was going to go through prison, which is no picnic. I mean, not only are you locked up and prevented from doing things, but I mean, the culture in prison, it's just horrible. A lot of terrible things that people go through. But enduring those things, suffering that persecution, persevering in prayer and faith, growing in their knowledge, reading, making contacts with the prison chaplain, other good people, that's part of their path to holiness. And there are some saints in our prisons. So I just use that as a kind of extreme example. Probably the people listening to this podcast are not in prison. I'm not sure if you can get podcasts in prison. So, we might say at one level, well, we're all better off than those prisoners. And if there's hope for them, there's hope for me. So no matter how things have gone, no matter what's happened to us, or no matter what we've done, there's hope. God is able to bring good out of evil. In fact, he never allows an evil from which he cannot bring a greater good. And so if there are things that we've done, things that have happened to us, ultimately it's for our good. Doesn't mean that it's easy or painless or that we would have chosen it if we had a, a, a several options to choose from, but it does mean that it's a path that God is with us, and he's bringing us to holiness on this path. So it gives us a reason for hope. That's one of the fundamental gifts of Christianity, is that we always have a reason for hope, no matter where we are, no matter what has happened. Hope for ourselves and hope for others.
Yeah, as you're talking about hope, I know that I've had the thought before that of the virtues, sometimes hope's the hardest, because we're surrounded by people around us who don't always live up to their promises. So there's a certain creeping that say, as I started this episode, we get into patterns, we get into routines. Well, most of us can identify someone in our lives who never is going to show up on time. So what do? We adjust, we go out of our ways, we tell them they got to be there an hour before it actually starts. And then that works for about 2 years. Then you're telling them it's an hour and a half, and so on and so forth, to the point where it's flat out not reliable. And I think that we all can identify something like that. Now, there's obviously different degrees of importance to showing up for an event A versus an event B, but we can identify that, and seeing people that we care about fail can be certainly a loss of trust, but sometimes the more painful element is the loss of hope. And I think that that's when we start talking about your relationship with God, probably the most beneficial. That there's no reason ever to lose hope. That no matter how bad things are around you and people letting you down, or maybe even you letting yourself down, that at the end of the day, hope is always there. You might have to go through some struggles to atone for it, but hope is still there. And I think that that is something that you do a really good job at articulating, that I think that we as a whole, especially on an individual level, lose that. And I think that losing that fundamental fact is the slippery slope of losing faith. And I just wanted to, since you just spent that great example there, that if prisoners in a culture that most of us never want to be, we certainly don't want to put our children there, can still find hope in pretty much the darkest example you can think of within our society and still have it work. If God can reach into there, he can reach into whatever problems we have. Not saying that our problems aren't big or significant, but they're not as large, relatively speaking. And humility helps with that as well. But to keep hope in mind that God will not let you down is tremendous. And I just wanted to highlight that as you just gave that example.
Yeah. Yeah, hope is so powerful that, as St. Paul says, in hope we are saved. So hope actually saves us. And as you were just alluding to, Joe, that when we don't have hope, it can really be the loss of everything, even losing our salvation. Despair, despair is the great enemy. Cynicism is another sin against hope. When we look at the world and we say, "Ah, it's all going to hell in a handbasket," there's no hope for anyone. There's no hope for anyone, for anything. This political situation is hopeless. These rotten politicians do the worst kinds of things. These corrupt businessmen do the worst kinds of things. This stock market is coming apart. All that kind of negativity, right? It's so easy to fall into that stuff. It's an odd thing because we kind of place ourselves above it and judge and condemn everything else, which is a sin of pride. And then that pride also goes with a kind of despair, a hopelessness for these structures, for other people, for the world. So um, all that stuff really twists our hearts and is really demonic. Ultimately, I know that's strong, but it really is. I mean, it's the devil's attitude. The devil looked at God's plan for salvation, his choice of human beings, and he said, there's no hope for that. There's no way. There's no way that those creatures made of slime from the earth could ever be with us in heaven. That's just stupid. And it was that arrogance and envy that led the devil in pride to think, I can destroy them and set himself against God. So we can really do that. We can fall into that direction. It's so dangerous, but it's just kind of step by step giving up hope and for others, for ourselves, for it's not like there are Republicans and Democrats. It's not like the Republican Party is in heaven. Yeah, there are Republicans in heaven, I hope. I mean, but we all sort of transcend political parties in the end. But anyway, I mean, there's no reason to condemn all of that, as at the same time that um, we don't have to have despair over our political processes ever working out or over our president. It's the thing. The Bible illustrates also with the story of St. Paul. I mean, that guy being the apostle to the Gentiles, that guy writing the majority of the New Testament, really? You got to be kidding me. Poor Ananias, when he was asked by God to receive Paul and to form him and to bring him to the Lord, he's like, the guy that's murdering the Christians? Are you nuts? I mean, and it's real easy to look at people with the now Ananias, obviously Saint Ananias, who did accept God's call, and his immediate emotional reaction is certainly understandable. Like, really, are you sure? But to have real faith and say, okay, well, God can do that with Paul. He can do that with a lot of other people. Do that with our congressman, our senator, with our policeman, with our president, with this foreign ruler, with this, these people that we just kind of caricature as if we actually understood everything inside them and we were in a position to condemn them. No, there's a kernel of goodness in everyone that God can use for salvation. And it may depend on our prayers whether that kernel of goodness gets watered and rooted and actually grows in their lives. But perhaps the fact that we've turned our hearts away from someone, even to pray for them, means that they won't have that seed rooted. And then it's our fault, it's not their fault. So we have to take seriously. Hope is also a call for evangelization. We have to hope in people enough to believe that they can find conversion. I mean, after all, Constantine was able to be converted. And so the great emperor of the Roman Empire was able to be converted, and how many rulers throughout history were able to be converted and able to live lives of holiness even. So it's hope really makes a difference in how we live, how we view our own lives, and also how we approach others, and how we accept the call to evangelize, to share the gift of faith that we have received.
Yeah, and I think that some people have, as you mentioned there, your immediate gut response doesn't exclude you from doing something that's right. You can go, oh, just that doesn't feel right or whatever, but come to it being the right thing to do and doing it. And I think that one of the things that we can do moving forward to keep hope, because as I'm talking with you here, it really seems that hope is the key of turning the corner from something that's a painful problem within to growing out of it to getting to a place of peace. And one of the practices that I recall from when we did our virtue series on hope was to be thankful for the things you have. That you know, even in the most so-called hopeless times, there still are some positive things that are going out, and we overlook them as you would say the cynic does. That they look for the negative and how easy it can be to get caught into everything is wrong and everything is negative looking around us. And when in reality, that's not really true. If you'd actually line everything up on a list, there's going to be more light than dark. And that's just the nature of the world. But as things become less, sometimes we need them more. And, you can see that as an example with all this advertisement against smoking. There's less smoking than there has been in generations, but there's now more advertisements about less smoking than ever before.
Interesting.
So that's just the thing. There's also less car deaths than there ever have been before, but there's more advertisements about buckle up your seatbelt. Um,
Hmm.
so it is a natural human thing, as you're trying to overcome something, whether it's good or bad, as you're actually overcoming it and succeeding in your mission, to have this thought that you're failing and there's more of it, even though
Hmm.
that's not true.
Hmm.
And that's why I recommend sitting down and being just taking stock and being thankful for what you have, because it'll give you accurate perspective of
Hmm.
things are actually going better than they seem, and that will pretty much always be the case. Um, so so I wanted to give people that opportunity to sit down and to think about how that's true, especially when things are in their worst times. I know that we had a couple of months ago someone ask us, how do we give guidance to people who are going through the worst times? And hope and faith and love, keeping stop and Thanksgiving will certainly help with that. So I don't want to go into a side note or a tangent there. I want to let you keep us on pace here, Father, and keep us grounded.
Yeah. Well, you make a good point. It's our impressions of how things are going in our lives or in the world can easily be distorted, whether it's thinking about the most or problems, like you said, smoking or car deaths. I remember reading something that uh, people, whether the question of whether more people die from shark attacks or from falling airplane parts. And it turns out that more people die from falling airplane parts than from shark attacks. But because shark attacks are kind of like in the news, we see those things, we think, oh yeah, must be shark attacks. So It's yeah, it's interesting how easily our perspective can be distorted. And then the other thing that's kind of distorting is, looking at statistics. It's like, well, just because, you know, it's unlikely that people die of these things, what are the chances that I'll die of these things? Well, that's kind of its own, uncertainty, that it's, what we're interested in our own situation ultimately. So I'm not going to die, 5% of me.
Mm.
I'm either going to die or not die. If it touches your life, then it touches your life. It doesn't touch your life sort of partially. So um, yeah. Anyway, just always good to be careful about our perceptions and what's really happening in the world. And I know I always get this question about my ministry, the things that I've done in China, where I've had the chance to do some formation for sisters and seminarians. Everything I do there is legal, so people, oh, isn't that dangerous? Well, China is a completely diverse reality. 1.3 billion people, a larger landmass than the United States, and lots of local governments that behave in different ways. So there's active persecution in a couple of provinces, or at least where Christians are being treated in ways they would like not to be. The government will say it's not persecution. And other places where the faith is absolutely thriving beyond anything we've seen in the United States. One parish that has 30 seminarians, 40 priests have been ordained from that parish in the last 30 years, and they have 1,000 people that go to mass every day. That's the range of China. So anyway, making generalizations about how things are in the world, how things are in our country, how things are in our neighborhood or in our parish, those generalizations are always fraught with problems. So the better question is, what can I do to help? How can I push against my hopelessness and despair in order to make a positive contribution? As the overly used saying goes, better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. And what's the candle that I can light? What's the work of mercy that I can do? What's the prayer that I can say? And keeping our minds and hearts focused on those positive contributions we can make does a lot more good than wringing our hands, complaining about the darkness, and making generalizations about how bad things are.
Can't sum it up any better than that. So, on that note, we thank everyone for listening with us here today. We thank you guys for continuing to spread and to grow the cast. Each week, as we get the results in, it looks like it's almost always better than the week prior. So, we thank you guys for helping it to grow. We couldn't do it without you, and we'll be with you again next week.